Project management students, if you are listening to this, congratulations, you made it. Lucky chapter 13. This is our last chapter, the one that ties everything together for this class and for project management in general. This is one of the most recent areas to be added to PMI standard, which is project stakeholder management. Stakeholders, anybody who's affected by the outcome of a project. It makes sense to consider these folks, in addition to things like communications management, for example, to be able to determine how we keep people engaged in our project. You, as project manager, somebody who's in charge of project integration management, also need to think about your stakeholders. So what are our objectives for this chapter? Well, the objective for this chapter is to identify why this is such an important discipline and an important part of project management, and how we actually determine who our stakeholders are, how we communicate with them, how we make them engage in our projects and make the most of their expertise. So it's all about the stakeholder. So in terms of stakeholder management, really it's the newest part of the discipline, got added as an entire knowledge area by PMI to the PMP standard back in 2013. Why is it so important? Because, as we repeatedly say in this class, no matter if you're working with technology, people are still the biggest part of any organization. And you need to know how to deal with the folks who are affected or could affect your project. So, what happens? When we complete projects, for example, sometimes we have to cut people loose. You know, we've already completed the work. We don't need somebody's skills or expertise anymore. If we are project managers, we need to approach our stakeholders with honesty and also with compassion. Also, by positioning ourselves as somebody who understands the needs of everybody affected by the project, we could be also making ourselves better regarded within our organization. Regardless, we need to understand why people have different concerns going into and out of projects. Somebody, for example, who has a looming job departure, somebody who might lose their job because the project is completed, may have all the reason in the world to slow us down. So in terms of why do people who are involved with projects make them go awry? Why do they particularly slow down projects? Well, if you don't engage people, if they're not bought into your project, they may actually try to sabotage your project. They may try to slow it down. If they regard you as somebody who is threatening their job, they may try to derail you. They may not have ever bought into the project in the first place, or see themselves as non-achievers. People who are overachievers, for example, also can alienate people. If you're an overly zealous project manager, you may alienate people who think you work too hard. And also keep in mind, not everybody has the same kind of motivation. Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, for example, we talked about in a previous chapter. Some people are motivated by the very work itself, where others are motivated by extrinsic rewards, getting paid or getting recognition, as opposed to the intrinsic satisfaction of doing the work. So in terms of the processes itself, knowing who your stakeholders are often is sometimes elusive to people. It's not just the people working on your project, it's people affected by the outcomes or who may be sponsoring the project as well. So how do we plan how to manage those folks? That's planning stakeholder management. Engaging them. Stakeholder engagement. How do people want to be spoken to? What motivates them? What form do they want to receive communications? How often? Yes, this crosses over with communications management as well. And we also want to monitor that our stakeholders are being kept in a process, kept involved in our entire discussion. So here's some great examples of these areas. Identifying stakeholders. A lot of these things are going to come right out of the project charter, the tools and techniques and outputs. Again, I won't read these to you other than to say in each area, whether we're identifying who these folks are, planning how we're going to manage them, actually manage them, and then finally engaging them, it comes down to effective use of tools and communication and documenting what we're doing so we know who our stakeholders are, we learn who they are, and they can change over time, and we're keeping a careful running tab of that as well. So how do we identify who stakeholders are? We've got internal and external stakeholders, for example. If you're working on the project, if you're part of the staff, if you're part of the people who are going to be receiving goods. For example, if we're designing a new recruiting system for enrollment management at St. Francis University, enrollment management is our internal customer, for example. Sometimes the external folks, if we're serving an external customer, that's an external stakeholder. People who supply parts to us. even the general population, if we're producing a product that they want. Anybody outside of our company, for example, can be considered to be an external stakeholder. So in terms of other stakeholders, the program manager, obviously, the person who's managing the program or the portfolio or the project, also the folks who are affected by them. If you're working long hours and not going home and not keeping yourself recharged, your family's a stakeholder here as well. So are labor unions, so are customers, anybody who is outside your company. And again, to reiterate, your folks you buy supplies from, your suppliers and your vendors could be stakeholders as well. So when we create a stakeholder registry, we're basically writing down who all is affected by our project, who could be affected by it, how can we communicate with them, and what classification do they have. Here's a great example of a stakeholder register. So we've got the name, the title, whether or not this person is internal or external to our company, what their role is, and what their contact information is, for example. So we can put email or phone numbers. We may also want to write down information, for example, if they are supportive of the project or not, just like we did in the project charter. If we have identified who these folks are in terms of our stakeholders, we may also want to know what kind of power they elicit over the project. For example, power versus interest. Here's a great example, and this is, again, right from our text, about who our stakeholders are. The folks who have high power and high interest, the ones and the twos, are the people you need to spend your time managing, because they're the folks who can control whether or not the project is successful, you're getting the resources you want, and you want to make sure their needs are being met. So we're trying to determine who our high-profile, high-importance power players are here. So in terms of engagement levels, you can have people who don't know the project's going on at all, but can still be stakeholders. If we, for example, run a sewage treatment plant, people who know nothing about our plant still have to drink the water, for example. There are people who maybe know about our project who don't like it. Well, I don't like your new project internally because what you're doing could eliminate jobs. Neutral. I know it's happening, but I don't really care. It doesn't really affect me. Supportive. I really love this new system because it's going to make my daily job easier. And leading. Those are folks like us, the project manager, who are making this project happen and know why it's important. So we're stakeholders too, project managers. So again, when it comes down to your project sponsors, these are people you have to keep happy. If somebody decides, for example, as your sponsor, the person who's helping you get this project greenlit, that something needs to change, it's important to listen to these folks. They can affect your well-being, they can affect the success of the project. You really need to consider them in the equation here. So before you just immediately say, no, that's out of scope, think about who it is you're talking to and how you want to engage with them. It's always good to have a dialogue. So how do we manage these stakeholders? How do we plan to do this? What we want to consider, what level of relationship do we have? Do we have to be informal or formal? If these folks are colleagues of ours in a relatively informal organization, we might be able to be very informal with them. We've got to consider, when we go back to the management plan though, what are the levels of engagement? What kind of relationships do we have? How do these folks like to be spoken to? And what are our strategies for keeping these people in the loop? So there's also a consideration, because we're putting very confidential information potentially into these kinds of documents. You want to closely control, for example, who has access to this information and tightly control it. If you're going to be honest, there may be things that are not complimentary that you're writing down in this information. You'll see examples in the coming slides. So in terms of project success, managing your engagement, keeping connected with people is a way to ensure that they're continuing to buy into your project. For example, if you had a sponsor who got this project greenlit in the first place, you want that person to look good as well. That person, maybe part of the reason they're engaging with you is goodwill or belief in the project, but they may also have professional status to gain from this as well. So make sure you're keeping them in the loop with what you're doing exactly. So here's an example of an expectations matrix. So if we have a particular stakeholder, what is that person's expectation that they want the project to say in scope, that they have expectations for meetings, for example, in the technology and standards arena. Corporate IT may have a different perspective at a managerial level than we do personally. So if you're managing the stakeholders' engagement, you're also heading off potential issues before they happen. If there are issues with how the project is rolling out, your stakeholders should have a way of finding out. And again, this goes back to good communications management, keeping people in the loop who are affected by the changes and possibly the mistakes that have been made. So here's an example of an issue log which you might want to have some labeled. You might want to have labeled so that individuals can see what's going on with the project. This is very similar in some ways to a risk register, but an issue log, a series of documents, for example, that detail what's gone wrong with your project, being available to stakeholders could be a good thing. I want to make a point here, guys, as we go through this class and as we're, of course, moving to wrapping up the class here, there are a number of documents you could use in a variety of situations. Doesn't mean you're going to use all of them. For example, you may or may not have an issue log. You may be using the risk register that we created in a previous chapter to communicate directly with stakeholders. These are all options on the table which you could possibly choose to use or not. So what's a best practice for managing stakeholders? I think being clear and honest, explaining to your stakeholders what the consequences are of the project succeeding or failing. And at times you may have to disagree. You may have to disagree with the people who are backing your project and stay the course and say to these stakeholders, look, trust me, I'm a project manager with a proven track record. At least you hope that you are. So best practice is to act with integrity. So in terms of monitoring the engagement, you can't control what somebody thinks, but you can control that they're getting communicated with, that they're getting information. How do you engage people? Well, I like to think in a classroom, for example, sometimes I have to be very entertaining. I mean, I'm not sure how entertaining I am on a narrated lecture on a YouTube video, but I try to be entertaining in the classroom because I have the ability to interact. And how do you keep your stakeholders engaged? I think generally speaking, people love talking about questions. They love answering questions or giving their perspective. So the more you engage your stakeholders and ask those folks to share their opinions, the more engagement you're likely to get. So again, the more we include someone in the conversation, the more likely people are to be a part of the conversation. If you're a teacher who stands in front of a room and just does nothing but talk at students, you're going to have a hard time in the long run probably getting people engaged. So in terms of how we engage, this comes down to the generational concerns again. We've got an entire generation of people who've grown up with technology, 2 generations actually, if we count Gen Z and millennials. And we've got folks who are in the in-between generations, people like myself who are Gen X. What it comes down to is realizing that culturally, different generations are going to have different ways of communicating, and to try to manage both the expectations and the bridging of cultures where possible. So in terms of using project management software or other software, simple stuff like Microsoft Word and PowerPoint can be great. Simple presentation that breaks information down for stakeholders who may not be involved every day with your project can help. So can blogs or Google Docs. Whatever it is that your organization uses to collaborate, the bottom line is to put the information into a form in which your stakeholder is likely to be able to glean important information from it. Social media can be used too. I mean, if you're dealing with external audiences, reporting on project progress over social media can make a lot of sense as well. It all depends on the size and scope of your project. So in terms of global stakeholders, it can be tough to keep in touch with everybody and to communicate in the method in which all parties can get involved, particularly when you're dealing across time zones and cultures. We talked about this a little in communications management. It just means that you as a project manager have to learn somebody else's culture as well. So in terms of stakeholders, if we start talking about agile or adaptive environments, for example, it just means that the more you're able to make information readily available to your stakeholders for them to ingest on their own time because of the lack of formality and things like project meetings, you may get better results. So folks, this is our end cap to our project management experience. I hope that this tie-in with stakeholders, with you being one of my key stakeholders, my students and my colleagues, I hope that you have enjoyed your experience together learning about the field of project management. A few parting words. Just remember, not every single tool we discussed or approach is right for every single situation. So use what works. use what makes sense, and I thank you very much for taking your time to be a part of this class. Have a great day, and I hope to speak with you soon.